The year was 1873, and the world had decided to die. For 5 days, snow fell from a sky the color of slate. It fell without pause, without mercy, burying the world in a thick, white silence. It covered the plains, choked the timberline, and wrapped the land in a hush so profound you could hear your own heart beating like a funeral drum. And in the last cabin, standing at the edge of that forgotten timber, a woman named Honora Wilde had already decided the world wasn't worth the trouble. Her home smelled of ghosts. The ghost of smoke from the summer fire that had eaten its roof, and the ghost of a life that had burned down long before that. She'd patched the hole with canvas and old quilts, sealing herself inside like a wounded animal, nursing a grief so cold it made the blizzard outside feel like a warm day. The neighbors didn't come by anymore. Truth be told, they never really had. They'd stopped by once, right after her wedding was called off. Right after Caleb Booker left her standing on the church steps, veil in her hands like a wilted flower, her stomach hollow with a shame worse than any hunger. The townswomen had looked at her, their eyes filled with a cruel kind of pity, and they'd whispered a single word. Ruined, like she was a gallon of milk left out in the sun. She didn't fight them, she didn't argue. What was the point? Her mother was buried out back under a crooked wooden cross. Her father was long gone, vanished to whatever dark place angry men go when they can't stand the sight of their own daughters. So Honora stayed. She lived on a diet of potatoes, snowmelt, and a crushing absolute silence. And the silence, she found, was the easiest part to swallow. But tonight was different. Tonight, something was moving in the wind. She felt it before she heard it, a strange pressure against the air, a weight the storm carried that her skin understood before her mind could catch up. The fire in her hearth crackled low, a single pop of wood making her flinch. She was a bundle of nerves, a rabbit listening for the snap of a twig. Then came the knock. 3 solid thuds against her door. Not loud, not rushed, just deliberate. The kind of knock that says, I am here, and I am not afraid to wait. Honora froze. Her hand hovered over the skillet on the stove, her entire body rigid. A visitor? Out here? In this storm? It had been weeks since she'd seen another soul. The last one was the preacher who'd brought a sack of flour and a sermon about repentance she hadn't asked for. Most folks in town treated her like a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered to their daughters. The girl who chose disgrace over a respectable marriage. The girl who was now utterly, completely alone. She stood up, her legs stiff with a fear she couldn't name, and shuffled toward the door. The wind howled, rattling the warped glass in the window, making the lantern on the porch sway like a hanged man. She took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. What would you do? Alone, in the middle of a world-ending blizzard, with a stranger at your door. Would you open it? She did, and the world rushed in. Snow swirled around her ankles with a furious hiss, and her eyes struggled to adjust to the blinding white maelstrom outside. For a moment she saw nothing. Then the swirling flakes parted, and 2 figures resolved out of the storm. They were shadows carved from winter and granite. 2 towering men, both shirtless, their bare chests scarred and steaming in the frigid air. The snow clung to their long, dark braids like delicate lace, a strange and terrifying beauty. Their eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto hers and did not waver. They were Apache, and not from any local camp she'd ever heard of. They were giants, built of corded muscle and a silence that felt older than the mountains. They just stood there, looking at her with the stillness of stone, their faces etched with an exhaustion so deep it seemed they had walked from the edge of the earth to find her door. Her voice was a dry croak. She hadn't used it all day, and it caught in her throat. The man on the left took a half-step forward. His face was all sharp angles, a face chiseled by grief and hardened by war. A long red scar, still fresh, ran from his shoulder down his chest. His breath misted in the air, a pale cloud in the dying light, but his gaze held hers, steady and unblinking. "We need shelter," he said. His voice was deep, slow, and rumbled through the floorboards. "Just for the night." The other man stood just behind him, his arms folded across his massive chest. He was quieter, his eyes darting from her face to the blizzard, then back again. He looked younger, but his frame was just as broad, his shoulders just as powerful. His lips were cracked and bleeding at the corner. Honora's mind raced. 2 shirtless Apache men at her door, in the middle of a storm, asking for shelter. Every warning, every story she'd ever been told screamed at her to slam the door, to bar it shut, to hide. But then she looked past them, into the raging, indifferent white of the storm. And she looked behind her, at the small, sputtering fire in her hearth, the only warmth in her entire world. She didn't know if it was fear that made her hesitate, or some deeper, stranger instinct. But she knew what it felt like to be left out in the cold. "One night," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. And she stepped aside. They entered her cabin without a sound. No heavy boots stomping on the floorboards, only the soft, wet padding of bare feet on wood. Their presence filled the small room, thick and heavy like smoke, displacing the lonely air she had grown so used to. She closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality, and the howl of the storm was instantly muffled, leaving a tense, charged silence in its wake. The air inside was warmer, but it was not comfortable. Honora moved around them like a stray dog circling a pair of wolves, unsure who was the hunter and who was the hunted. They didn't speak. They didn't sit. They simply stood in the center of her home, as if awaiting some unspoken command, their bodies radiating a dangerous energy. You can sit if you want," she said, her voice cracking again. She hated how small and weak she sounded. The first man, the one with the severe face, gave a single, sharp nod. He moved toward the fire and sat cross-legged on the floor, his back ramrod straight as he faced the flames. The second man followed, his eyes glancing at her face for just a second before he lowered himself beside his brother. That's what they felt like. Brothers. Not by blood, perhaps, but by something deeper, a shared history, a shared silence that bound them together. She watched them from the far side of the room, her fingers wrapped so tightly around an empty mug that her knuckles were white. Her eyes kept flicking to their skin, to the road map of scars that covered their chests and arms. Each mark was a chapter in a history book she couldn't read, a story of violence and survival written in flesh. They didn't shiver in the cold drafts of the cabin. They didn't complain. They just breathed, slow and steady, like men who had walked through hell and found it only slightly inconvenient. "I'm Honora," she said into the quiet, not sure why she was offering them anything, not even her own name. The second man, the younger one, nodded faintly. "Kai," he murmured, his voice softer than the others. The first man didn't turn from the fire. "Talon." The name fit him, sharp, dangerous, elemental. I only have one cot," she stammered, feeling foolish. "We will sit," Talon said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The wind howled outside again, a lonely, mournful sound. Honora lit another lantern, the small flame pushing back the shadows, and placed it on the floor near them. Then she retreated to her side of the room, to the small stove where a pot of thin potato stew was simmering. She poured a little of the stew into a tin bowl. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Then she took a breath and walked it over to them. She crouched down, her knees protesting, and set the bowl on the floor between them. "They say I'm a fool," she muttered, more to herself than to them, "for staying out here alone." Kai, the younger one, looked up at her. His eyes, for the first time, held something other than exhaustion. It was a flicker of understanding. "They don't know solitude," he said softly. "No," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "They don't." And in that moment, for the first time in months, she didn't feel like prey. She didn't feel ruined. She felt seen. Talon took the bowl. He didn't offer a word of thanks, but it didn't feel like rudeness. It felt like something else, something deeper, a kind of reverence. His posture seemed to say, "I will not waste what cost you something to give." They passed the bowl between them, each taking a small, measured portion, their movements economical and deliberate. Honora retreated to the window, watching the wind whip the snow into dancing ghosts among the trees. Her breath fogged the cold glass. She could feel their presence behind her, a solid, unspoken weight in the room. It was both unnerving and, strangely, comforting. She thought of Caleb Booker. She thought of how his face had twisted in disgust when she'd told him she couldn't prove her purity after her own father had struck her down in a rage. How quickly his love had curdled into contempt. "No man wants used things, Honora," he'd sneered. She remembered how the church ladies, who had once smiled at her, suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. But these men, these strangers hadn't asked. They hadn't judged. They hadn't looked at her like a piece of spoiled meat. They just ate her meager stew and sat by her fire and breathed her air. Later, long after the stew was gone, she lay down on her cot, facing the rough-hewn wall. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. The fire hissed and popped. The storm groaned against the cabin, and behind her, two shadows sat unmoving, sentinels in the dark. She thought of the way Kai's eyes had softened when he'd seen the careful stitches on her patched canvas roof. She thought of how Talon hadn't looked at her body, not once. He'd looked at her hands, at her face, at the fire. Just one night, she murmured to herself, a promise and a prayer. But in the deepest part of her heart, a place she thought had frozen solid long ago, something stirred. It was a tiny, flickering ember, something old and soft and terribly, terribly dangerous. And as she lay there in the dark, listening to the breathing of the two strangers in her home, she wasn't sure which frightened her more, the bitter, deadly cold that raged outside her door, or the fragile, unfamiliar warmth that was now, quietly, beginning to glow inside. And still, she did not turn over. She just listened. The wind had died by morning, but the cold had burrowed into the very soul of the world. A thick, heavy blanket of snow lay over the land, a secret too old and too deep to unearth. The cabin groaned as Honora kindled the fire, her fingers stiff and shaking. Her breath was a visible cloud in the dim morning light. Behind her, the two men stirred. They moved with a slow, deliberate quiet, as if they were a part of the silence itself, not an intrusion upon it. She had half expected to wake up and find them gone, vanished back into the storm as mysteriously as they had arrived. But they were still there. Talon rose first. His massive frame seemed to swallow the small space as he approached the fire. He said nothing, his eyes fixed on the new flames as they licked at the kindling. His bare chest, which seemed impervious to the chill, bore a new mark this morning, a fresh, angry scratch from a branch or a fall in the dark. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his breath a steady rhythm, a man made of stone and resolve. Kai stirred second, more softly, stretching his limbs with a quiet groan, like a man who hadn't known a moment of real rest in days. He rubbed his shoulder, a small wince tightening the corner of his eye. As the thin blanket he'd wrapped around himself slipped, Honora saw it. It wasn't a scratch. It was a gash. Ugly, red, and swollen. It was poorly cleaned, the edges inflamed, a wound that was festering. Her heart gave a little jump. She set the kettle on the stove, her hands suddenly busy. She tried not to stare, but the wound called to her. It was a hurt that needed tending, a broken thing that needed mending. It was a language her hands understood. "I can clean that," she offered, her voice barely a whisper above the simmer of the water. Kai's eyes met hers. He looked surprised, not suspicious, as if kindness was a foreign currency he hadn't traded in for a long time. After a long moment of silence, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She gathered her meager supplies. An old bottle of whiskey, not for drinking, but for cleaning. A few frayed strips of linen she'd boiled clean last fall. A half-broken tin basin. She felt a pang of shame at how little she had to offer. When she approached him, Kai slowly shrugged off the blanket, fully exposing the wound on his shoulder. It was worse up close, crusted over, but with an angry red poison haloing the edges. It had the color of a hurt that had been ignored for too long. Her hands moved with a careful, gentle reverence, as if she were tending to something sacred. She soaked a cloth in the harsh whiskey and dabbed at the edges of the cut. He flinched. Just once, a sharp intake of breath. "You've had this for a while," she said, her voice soft. He hesitated, his eyes on the fire. 5 days. "And no one stitched it?" "There was no one," he said simply. The fire popped nearby, sending a single bright ember flying through the air like a firefly before it winked out and died. Across the room, Talon didn't speak. He didn't even look. But his body was too still, his shoulders rigid. He was listening with his entire being. "You should have let us sleep outside," Kai murmured, as she wrapped the last clean strip of linen around his shoulder, her fingers brushing against his warm skin. "We brought the cold with us." Honora finished tying the knot, her hands moving with a confidence she didn't feel. "I already had it," she said, her voice low and steady. "You just made it quieter." For a long, charged moment, neither of them moved. Her hands rested lightly on the fresh bandage. His breath caught just beneath her touch. A current passed between them, something unspoken and powerful. When she finally stepped back, her fingers were trembling. And she knew it wasn't from the cold, not entirely. But just as the fragile trust began to settle in the room, a new thought, sharp and cold as an icicle, pierced through Honora's mind. 5 days. He'd had the wound for 5 days. The snow had been falling for 5 days. They hadn't gotten this wound out here, in the storm. They had brought it with them. They were running. They weren't just seeking shelter from the weather. They were seeking shelter from something else entirely. The thin potato stew from last night suddenly felt heavy in her stomach. The silence in the cabin was no longer comforting. It was the silence of men who were hiding. Later, she served what was left of her cornbread, slicing the small loaf into 3 uneven wedges. She gave them the bigger pieces without thinking, a habit of scarcity and care she'd learned from her mother. Kai looked at his piece, then at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Talon just nodded once, his face an unreadable mask. He never used more words than he had to, but his silence wasn't cruel. It was guarded. The silence of a man who had learned that words were weapons, and he chose his carefully. The day crawled by. The light outside never truly became day, just a shifting from deep, oppressive gray to something slightly paler. The world beyond her window was a blank canvas of white, suffocating and beautiful all at once. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, old linen, and something new, waiting. She found herself watching Talon. He'd taken her dull axe from the woodpile and now stood in the open doorway, staring out at the tree line. He stood there for a long time, motionless, just watching. Then, with a sudden explosive movement, he brought the axe down on the stump she used for chopping. The sound shattered the silence, echoing across the snow like a cannon shot. His muscles coiled and flexed under his scarred skin, each swing a display of controlled, brutal power. He wasn't just chopping wood. He was working through something, venting a rage or a fear that had no words. Shards of wood flew with every impact. She should have looked away. It felt too private, too raw. But she didn't. She couldn't. When he finally returned, his hands were blistered and red from the unfamiliar tool. He'd stacked a neat, tall pile of firewood by the door, enough to last her a week. "You didn't need to do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something beyond the stone-faced warrior. "You did," he said simply. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. He meant she needed the wood. But what she heard was something else entirely. You needed someone to help. By dusk, she had managed a pot of beans, boiled thin and stretched with flour to make them seem like more than they were. The three of them ate together, their knees nearly touching as they huddled around the small fire. No one said grace, no one spoke of the future. But something sacred hung in the air between them, in the shared warmth and the shared meal. And then, a knock shattered it all. It wasn't the deliberate, patient knock from the night before. This was a hard, impatient banging. The kind of knock that was meant to be heard by the whole world, meant to intimidate, meant to break something. Honora froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Talon was on his feet in an instant, a predator sensing a threat. He was already halfway to the door, his body coiled and ready. But Honora held up a hand, a gesture of surprising authority. "I'll answer it," she whispered. She knew who it was. She didn't have to see them. She could feel the malice seeping through the wood. When she opened the door, 3 men from town stood on her porch. Harv Boone and Lem Sanders, 2 men who chewed tobacco and spat judgment in equal measure. And between them, his face pale and pinched with cold, stood the sheriff's useless son, Caleb Booker, her former fiancé. He looked the same, only colder, meaner. His eyes, once full of what she'd mistaken for love, now held nothing but contempt. They landed on her, then slid past her shoulder, into the cabin, fixing on the shadows of the 2 men sitting by her fire. "We heard stories," Harv said, his voice thick with disdain. "You taking in strays now, Honora? Heard you're keeping company with Indians." Her jaw tensed. She could feel Kai and Talon behind her, their presence a solid wall of silent fury. "I gave shelter to 2 men caught in the storm," she said, her voice level. Caleb snorted, a bitter, ugly sound. "Shelter's one thing. But the rumors say they ain't sleeping in the barn, are they?" His eyes raked over her, insulting her with a single glance. Kai moved then, a slow, fluid motion that brought him right behind her shoulder. Talon remained in the shadows by the fire, a figure of immense potential violence. "Your daddy would roll in his grave knowing what his daughter's become," Lem muttered, spitting a stream of brown juice into the clean, white snow. That was it. That was the spark. Something inside Honora, something that had been beaten down and shamed into silence, finally broke. "My father beat me," she said, her voice soft but sharp as a shard of glass. "And then he left. If he's dead, I hope the crows got to him first." A shocked, sharp silence fell over the porch. Caleb's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. "They're not like us, Honora. You know what they are. You know what they do." And then, from the shadows, Talon's voice came, low and even and laced with more menace than a scream. "Neither are you." Caleb froze. The blood drained from his face. He looked at Talon, a dark giant rising from the fire-lit shadows, and for the first time, Caleb Booker looked afraid. Harv Boone, sensing the shift in power, tugged on Caleb's arm. "Let's go, Caleb. She ain't worth freezing over." Caleb hesitated, his pride warring with his sudden fear. He shot Honora one last look, a look filled with hatred and a strange, possessive fury. Then he turned and stomped off the porch, his friends scrambling behind him. Honora closed the door before they could say more, her hand shaking. But she wasn't shaking with fear. It was rage. Pure, clean, righteous rage. She turned. Kai was putting a folded blanket back on the cot, his movements gentle. Talon stepped out of the shadows, pausing just inches from her. His dark eyes searched hers for a long, silent moment. He saw the fire in them, the strength she had forgotten she possessed. And then, without a word, he reached for her hand. He didn't grab it. He didn't squeeze it. He just held it. His hand was large, rough, calloused from work and war. It was steady, grounding, the way a great ancient tree might hold the earth. And she let him. She threaded her fingers through his, and she held on tight. No words were spoken that night, as they sat by the fire. The wind had returned, howling its lonely song, but for the first time, the cabin didn't feel hollow. It felt safe. Later, when she lay down on her cot, she could still feel the phantom warmth of his hand in hers. And this time, She faced the fire, not the wall, and somewhere in the hush of the endless winter, a strange, fierce peace settled over her bones. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know why these men were here, or what dangers they brought with them. But she knew one thing for certain. Caleb's visit wasn't about town gossip. It wasn't about her reputation. He was scared. He was scared of the men in her cabin. And for the first time in a long, bitter year, she no longer feared being seen. The snow didn't melt. Out here, in the high country, it never really melted until spring. It just got heavier, older, deeper. By the third morning, the path to the well was a trench buried to her knees. Honora moved through it like a ghost, dragging the wooden pail behind her, her breath fogging in the flat, gray dawn. Each step away from the cabin felt like a risk. Each step back felt like a homecoming. Inside, the fire whispered, and the two men had already fallen into a quiet domestic rhythm that felt both strange and deeply natural. Talon sat by the hearth, meticulously cutting strips of hide with a knife she hadn't realized was so sharp. Kai was by the stove, crushing dried pine needles in a small bowl, the sharp, clean scent filling the air. They didn't ask if they should. They just did. They saw a need, and they filled it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, holding her wet gloves, just watching them. Something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't a loud, sudden change, but a slow, quiet settling, like timber adjusting to the changing of the seasons. She felt it every time Kai passed her a tin cup of the pine needle tea without looking directly at her, a gesture of comfortable familiarity. She felt it when Talon, a man who walked barefoot in the snow, took the time to brush the snow off his leggings before stepping into her home. That afternoon, a thought struck her. She climbed the rickety ladder to the small loft, dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from a crack in the roof. In the corner, under a pile of old canvas, was a cot frame. It had been her mother's. The mattress had rotted away years ago, but the frame was solid oak. She dragged it to the edge of the loft, the wood groaning in protest. She lowered it down the ladder one rung at a time, the weight awkward and heavy. Dust and memories rose in her throat, making her cough. Kai saw her struggling. He stood up and moved to help, his hands outstretched. But she shook her head, her pride a stubborn, foolish thing. "It's fine," she said, her voice strained. I thought, you shouldn't have to sleep on the floor." Neither man answered right away. Talon stopped his work, his hands stilling on the piece of hide. He looked at the dusty cot frame, then at her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "We are not staying," he said finally. It wasn't a threat or a promise. It was just a fact. "I know," she said, dragging the frame closer to the fire. She found an old quilt, thin but clean, and spread it over the ropes. "But you haven't left either." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was cautious. It was the silence of a wild thing caught between the safety of the shadows and the risk of a forward step. The cot stayed. That night, Kai lay on it, his long frame barely fitting. Talon, however, still sat by the fire, his legs folded, his back to the wall, his eyes tracking the dance of the flames. A watchman, a guardian. Honora found herself unable to settle. She busied herself with pointless tasks, stirring ashes that were already cold, folding linens that were already folded, wiping down the same dusty shelf 3 times. She felt a restless energy humming under her skin. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, or if they were waiting for something too. "Why don't you sleep?" she finally asked, her back to Talon. "I have slept enough," he replied, his voice a low rumble. She stopped her pointless cleaning and turned to face him. "You don't look like you have." His gaze met hers across the flickering firelight. "I sleep when no one is watching," he said, his voice low but firm. The words hung in the air between them. A confession, a warning. He was telling her he was always on guard, always alert. She didn't answer, didn't press him for more, but she didn't forget the words either. The days began to slip by, blurring into a single, continuous stretch of winter. They settled into a wordless communion, a shared existence that was built on presence rather than conversation. There were no declarations, no probing questions, only the simple, profound warmth of other bodies in the room, the small miracle of hot tea on a cold morning, and the gentleness of space that was not demanded, but given. One evening, Talon took her dull kitchen knives and, without her asking, sharpened them on a smooth stone from the hearth until they were sharp enough to shave with. Another day, Kai noticed a wobble in one of her chairs and quietly mended the broken leg with strips of the same hide Talon had been cutting. In return, she baked 2 loaves of bread, using up a precious hoard of her flour. She gave them the larger, fuller loaf without apology or explanation. It felt right. Sometimes, when the wind was still and the fire burned steady and bright, she could almost trick herself into believing they were a family. A strange, broken, silent family, but a family nonetheless. But the town hadn't forgotten them, and it would not let her forget either. One morning, just after dawn, 2 small children, bundled in ragged coats, crept up to her cabin. They didn't knock. They peered through the frosted glass of her window. When they saw the towering figure of Talon sweeping her porch with her old, worn-out broom, their eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Then they turned and ran, their small feet kicking up puffs of snow as they fled back toward town. Honora's heart sank. She knew what would happen now. The story would spread. The whispers would grow louder. That evening, as dusk was painting the snow in shades of purple and gray, a stone landed on her porch with a hard thud. It wasn't just a stone. Tied to it with a piece of dirty twine was a folded, crumpled piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she untied it. She unfolded it, her breath catching in her throat. The words were scrawled in charcoal, ugly and jagged. "He killed your father. Ask them." The world tilted on its axis. The floor seemed to fall away beneath her feet. Her father. Killed? She had told herself he had just left, that he had walked away in one of his drunken rages and never came back. It was a story she had repeated to herself so many times that she had almost started to believe it. But this note, this venomous little scrap of paper, it suggested a truth so monstrous she couldn't even grasp it. Ask them. Her eyes shot to Talon and Kai. They were watching her, their faces grim. They had heard the stone land. They had seen her read the note. She didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. She walked back inside, the stone feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. She went to the hearth and placed the stone silently among the embers. Then, she fed the note to the flames. It caught instantly, the ugly words curling into black ash with a venomous hiss. Kai watched her, his expression pained. His eyes looked older now, as if a terrible memory had just caught up with him. Talon stood up. He grabbed the thick coat she had given him, an old one of her father's, and stepped outside into the falling night without a word. He didn't return for hours. When he finally came back, long after the moon had risen, his knuckles were bloodied and bruised. A fresh cut bled over his right eye. His shoulders were tense with a violence barely contained. She said nothing about his injuries. She just poured him a cup of the pine needle tea. He took it, his big hands wrapping around the tin cup as if it were an anchor in a storm. Was it one of them? She asked quietly, her voice shaking. The men from town? Caleb? He didn't answer her directly. He just stared into the fire, his jaw tight. But she noticed how his chest rose and fell, his breathing slowly steadying as he sat in her presence, in the quiet safety of her cabin. Later that night, long after Kai had fallen into a restless sleep on the cot, Honora brought another blanket to him. "You sleep too near the door," she said, her voice barely audible. His eyes opened, and in the dim light, his mouth tilted in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "That's where the cold lives." She draped the blanket over his shoulder anyway. He didn't stop her. His skin was warm beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. The next morning, she was humming while she cooked. A small, forgotten tune from her childhood. The sound startled her, and she stopped mid-note, her hand freezing over the skillet. The melody had escaped without her permission. She couldn't remember the last time music had left her lips. Maybe before her mother's long fever. Maybe before the wedding that never was. Maybe before shame had become her constant companion. She turned, a blush rising on her cheeks, and found Kai watching her. He wasn't staring. He was just observing, quietly, kindly. "Your voice is soft," he said. "No one ever listens," she replied, turning back to the stove, scraping cornmeal into the pan with too much force. "I am." She dropped the spoon. It clattered loudly on the floor. When she crouched to pick it up, her hands were shaking again, but this time, it wasn't from fear. That night the door remained unlatched. No one mentioned it. Talon sat by the fire longer than usual, and Honora, for the first time, didn't retreat to her cot. She sat in the chair across from him, her knees tucked under her, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. For a long, long time, the only sounds were the whisper of the burning logs and the low moan of the wind against the cabin walls. The note. The words burned in her mind. "He killed your father. Ask them." "Why did you stay?" she asked him finally, her voice cutting through the quiet. He looked at her, his gaze slow and deliberate. His eyes were deep, not just in color, but in the burdens they carried. He seemed to weigh his words before he spoke them. "Because you didn't look away," he said. That was all. But it was enough. He was talking about the first night. When she had opened her door to two terrifying strangers, she had seen their scars, their exhaustion, their danger, and she hadn't slammed the door in their faces. She had looked past the fear and seen the need. The snow drifted against the door outside, a soft, relentless pressure. The cot creaked as Kai turned in his sleep. Talon remained seated, his powerful presence grounding the room like a root buried deep in the winter soil. Honora didn't sleep that night either, but she wasn't alone. She finally understood. The men weren't hiding from the storm. Caleb wasn't just a jilted lover. The town wasn't just gossiping. This was all connected. Her father, these men, Caleb's hatred. It was a dark, tangled knot. And she was standing right in the middle of it. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted by what might come next. She felt held by what had arrived, and had, against all odds, quietly remained. Snow hung in the air like a breath not yet spoken. The storm had passed, but winter had tightened its grip, burrowing into the bones of the prairie. Inside the cabin, time had lost its meaning. Days melted into one another, sealed with a silence that was no longer empty, but full of unspoken things. Honora rose early now, not from habit, but from a strange new desire. There was a peace in waking before the fire was fully lit, in seeing the silhouette of Talon outside, splitting logs in the gray dawn, steam curling from his bare back like a prayer. Kai would already be inside, humming a low, quiet tune under his breath as he crushed dried herbs between his fingers, preparing the morning tea that soothed the cough in her chest. No one spoke of leaving anymore. The question hung in the air, but it had become a different question. It was no longer when will you leave, but can you stay? The cabin, which had once been her prison, had become a sanctuary, a fortress, a home. One morning, as she stirred a pot of cornmeal mush with the end of a broken spoon, she caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Her cheeks had a touch of color again. Her shoulders weren't as hunched. Her eyes, which had been dull with grief for so long, held a new light. A wary light, but a light nonetheless. "Does the tea help?" Kai asked from behind her. His voice was the gentlest kind of interruption. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or tense. It was the comfortable quiet that grows between people who have seen each other's bruises and have chosen to stay anyway. But the world outside had not forgotten them, and it was a world that did not forgive. It was just past midday when she heard the hooves. Too many hooves. Not the sound of a friendly visit. It was the sound of purpose. The sound of a posse. Talon was outside, near the woodpile. She stepped onto the porch first, her apron still tied around her waist. She saw them then. A line of riders cresting the hill. Harv Boone was there again, and with him 3 other men from town, their faces hard and grim under the brims of their hats. They didn't slow as they approached. They fanned out, circling her small cabin like wolves that had tasted blood once and had come back for the kill. Harv spat a wad of tobacco into the pristine snow. It left an ugly brown stain. "Heard your pets are still here, Honora," he called out, his voice dripping with contempt. Honora said nothing. Her fingers clenched the rough fabric of her apron, but she stood her ground. She would not let them see her tremble. "You keeping them warm for us every night?" one of the other men jeered. "Or do they take turns?" Then Talon stepped into view. He moved from the side of the cabin, the axe still held loosely in his right hand. No shirt, despite the biting cold. Just steam and muscle, and a stare so cold and so deadly it silenced the smirking man in an instant. Harv stiffened in his saddle. His bravado wavered. "You threatening us, boy?" Talon didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was more threatening than any shout. The other men shifted uneasily in their saddles. One of them, a man with shifty eyes, let his hand drift down toward the pistol tucked in his belt. And then, Kai stepped out of the cabin door. He moved with a single, fluid grace. He had no weapon. He didn't need one. He simply came to stand beside Honora, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body through the thick wool of her dress. "She is not yours to speak to," Kai said. His voice was even, quiet. But it cut through the air like a razor. The man whose hand was on his pistol froze. He looked from Kai's calm face to Talon's murderous glare, and he seemed to shrink. He slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand away from his gun. Harv looked between the 2 brothers, then back at Honora, his face a mask of frustration and hate. "You're digging a hole you won't climb out of, girl," he snarled. From the side of the house, Talon's voice rumbled, low and final. "She is not afraid of dirt." That was it. The invisible line had been crossed. Harv cursed. A vile, ugly word. He wheeled his horse around so sharply that it reared, and then he galloped away, back toward the town that nurtured his hatred. The other men, their courage gone, scrambled to follow him, a pack of dogs with their tails between their legs. The snow swallowed the sound of their departure, and an immense silence fell once more. Honora let out a breath she hadn't even known she was holding. Her legs felt weak. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't let this bring trouble to you both." Talon stepped closer, lowering the axe and leaning it against the cabin wall. "Trouble was already here," he said, his eyes on the tracks their horses had left in the snow. "We just gave it a name." She turned to Kai. His dark eyes met hers, and in them, she saw no blame, no regret. "I didn't ask you to fight for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "No," Kai replied softly, a faint smile touching his lips. "You did not have to." Later that evening, the cabin was quieter than usual, but it was a different kind of quiet, not tense, full. It was full of the words that hadn't been said, full of the questions that none of them knew how to ask. Talon sat by the fire, carving a small piece of wood with one of her newly sharpened knives. Kai was repairing a broken leather strap on one of her boots, his stitches small and neat. Honora found herself baking again, even though no one was hungry. Her hands just needed something to do. When the bread was cooled, she tore it into 3 pieces and offered the first to Talon. He didn't look up from his carving as he took it, but his calloused fingers lingered against hers for half a breath longer than necessary. A spark of warmth shot up her arm. She moved to Kai, who accepted his piece with a small, grateful smile. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it still felt like a ray of summer sun in the dead of winter. After they ate, she didn't retreat to her cot. She didn't busy herself with chores. Instead, she gathered a blanket, spread it on the floor by the hearth, and sat down, not across from them, but between them. She looked at the fire, at the note she had burned, and at the two men who had become her unlikely guardians. She had to know. "Tell me something," she said into the quiet. "Anything. From before." Kai looked into the flames, his face softening with a distant memory. "We used to trap rabbits with our uncle when we were boys," he said. "Talon never liked to kill them, even for food. He would always find a reason to let the smallest one go free." Talon made a low grunting sound. "The small one's taste of sinew." Kai's smile widened. "He lies. He just liked their soft ears." And Honora laughed. A real laugh. A soft, startled sound that broke out of her like sunlight through an overcast sky. It felt foreign and wonderful in her own throat. She turned to Talon, her eyes shining. "Is it true?" He didn't smile, not with his mouth, but his eyes warmed as they met hers. "They reminded me of people who spend too much time running." "Like me?" she asked, her voice suddenly low. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "You did not run," he said. "You stayed." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. He was right. She hadn't run. She had stayed and faced the shame, the loneliness, the cold. She had endured. The silence wrapped around them again, but this time it was a comfortable, shared thing. When the fire had dimmed to glowing embers and the bread was gone, she stood up. But she didn't move toward her cot. Instead, she turned and looked at both men, her heart pounding in her chest, her voice as steady as the falling snow. "You can't stay here forever," she said. "No," Kai agreed, his face somber. "We only came for a night," Talon added, his voice a low rumble. "And you gave us more." Her breath trembled. "Then take more." The wind howled outside, shaking the very walls of the cabin. Neither man moved. Their dark eyes were fixed on her, searching her face, reading the truth she was finally brave enough to offer. Not until she slowly sat back down on the blanket between them. They moved then. Slowly, deliberately, they shifted closer, one on each side of her. There was no touch, no kiss, no grand declaration, only presence, only warmth, only the beginning of something vast and wordless and powerful unfolding in the heart of winter. When she finally lay down to sleep, they lay near her on the floor, their bodies a warm, solid barrier against the cold and the darkness. Not in passion, not in pity, but in a shared, quiet courage. In the profound stillness of choosing to stay, again and again, even when the world snarled and spat at them. Honora didn't sleep at once. She watched the shadows of the ceiling beams in the fire's faint glow. And she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she'd read that terrible note. She whispered it into the darkness, not to them, but to the fates that had brought them here. "My father, did you know him?" Neither of them answered, but in the heavy, listening silence, she felt her answer. Yes. The snow fell quietly, steadily, layering the world in a softness that masked its sharp, deadly edges. Morning came with silver skies and breath that curled like ghosts from their lips. The showdown with Harv Boone's men had changed something. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by the grim certainty that a final confrontation was coming. Honora stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot tea. She watched two small birds peck at the bare, frozen branches of a tree that hadn't bloomed in years. Behind her, in the warmth of the cabin, Kai was quietly mending the loose drawer beneath her stove. Talon was outside, methodically chopping the last of the firewood he'd cut days ago. He moved with a relentless, focused energy, as if each swing of the axe was a blow against the injustice that had brought them to her door. She didn't have to ask them to help anymore. They moved around her life as if they had always been a part of it, their presence a quiet, steady rhythm in the song of her survival. She wore her mother's old coat now, the one with the worn fur lining, and a pair of her father's old boots, stuffed with wool to make them fit. Her hair was tied back in a simple, loose braid. She looked nothing like the girl who had once stood on the church steps in a white dress, waiting for a groom who never came. That girl had wilted under the town's scorn. The woman who remained had been forged in ice and fire, and then she heard it, the sound she had been dreading. Hoofbeats, a long line of them, descending the hill from town like a slow, black avalanche. There was no laughter this time, no jeering calls, just the grim, determined faces of 7 men riding under snow-dusted hats, their long coats hiding the weapons they surely carried. Caleb Booker rode at the front, his face a pale, tight mask of fury, and beside him, a figure that made Honora's blood run cold. The preacher. His black robes stood out starkly against the snow, a blot of sanctimonious darkness. He rode with his gloved hands folded over his saddle horn, his eyes fixed on her cabin with a cold, righteous purpose. This was it. The reckoning had arrived. Honora set her mug down on the porch rail. She stepped off the porch and into the snow, her oversized boots sinking slightly. She would not meet them from a position of retreat. She would meet them on her own ground. Talon had already straightened from his chopping, the axe lowered to his side. His eyes flicked to hers, not for direction, but for her lead. He would not act before she did. He never had. The cabin door opened, and Kai joined them. He moved silently, dusting wood shavings from his hands. He took his place on her other side. The three of them stood as one, not touching, but joined by something stronger than arms, harder than bone. A shared purpose. The riders slowed to a stop about 10 yards from the cabin, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. Caleb dismounted first, his movements stiff and angry. "You've got one more chance, Honora," he said, his voice loud, carrying in the still air. It was a performance meant for the men behind him. "Come home. Let the preacher here fix what's been made wrong between us." Honora said nothing. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her spine was straight as a pine tree. "You've been seen with them," he continued, his voice rising, thick with manufactured outrage. "The whole town knows. They say you're laying with both of them, wearing your sin like it's a lace dress." The preacher spoke next, his voice smooth and oiled, but with an undertone of steel. "There is still redemption for you in the eyes of God, my child, but not if you keep them. Not if you choose to keep living like this." He gestured to Talon and Kai, his gloved hand dripping with condescension. Kai's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Talon didn't move a fraction of an inch, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. Honora took one step forward, the snow crunched under her boot. "I am not yours," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying with perfect clarity. "And I never was." Caleb's eyes darkened with fury. "They've bewitched you. They've filled your head with their savage lies." "They protected me," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "They protected me when no one else would. Not you, not him." She nodded toward the preacher. "And certainly not the good people of your town." The preacher raised a gloved hand, as if to ward off her words. "They are not of our ways, Honora. They are heathens." Honora shook her head slowly, a sad, bitter smile touching her lips. "Neither are you, preacher. You speak of God, but you worship gossip. You left me to rot because of rumors. You all did." Caleb's face went red, the color of spoiled meat. "I gave you everything," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You gave me shame," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word was a dagger. "You branded me as used and worthless to save your own pathetic pride, and when I needed love, you brought a rope to hang my reputation with." That hit home. His hand twitched, his fingers spasming near the butt of the pistol at his hip, and Talon moved. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his height and sheer presence cutting a line through the cold air. He placed himself slightly in front of Honora, a living shield of muscle and fury. "If you raise that hand," Talon said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but filled with a terrifying promise, "you will not get to lower it." The wind picked up, a low howl that dragged across the hill like a warning from the earth itself. Caleb's hand froze. He looked at Talon's face, at the promise of swift and brutal death in his eyes. He looked at Kai, who stood ready, balanced on the balls of his feet. And he looked at Honora, at the unbreakable strength he saw there now, a strength he had never known she possessed. And his courage failed him. "I hope the snow takes you all," he muttered, his voice weak and petulant. He turned, scrambled back onto his horse, and spurred it down the hill without looking back. One by one, the other men followed him, even the preacher, their grand crusade collapsing into a shameful retreat. They left behind a silence that was louder than any gunshot. Honora stood unmoving, the cold air burning her lungs. Talon came to her side, his breath clouded in front of him. "You could have let us go," he said softly, speaking of the night before, when she'd asked about her father. "You could have saved yourself." "I couldn't," she replied, turning to face him, "because it was never just about one night." Kai walked to stand with them, his expression soft. "What now?" he asked. Honora looked from Talon's fierce, protective face to Kai's steady, gentle one. And she knew the answer. She knew what she wanted. "Now," she said, her voice a whisper that felt more sacred than any prayer in the preacher's cold church. "I am asking, will you stay? Not because I need shelter, not because I am afraid, but because I choose you." Talon's large, rough hand found hers, his fingers wrapping around her own. It felt like the earth holding a seed, promising life in the spring. Kai stepped forward and touched her other shoulder, his touch light, a gentle blessing on her courage. There was no church, there was no preacher, no crowd, just the falling snow, the sighing wind, and three people choosing to build a world together in a place that had tried to tear them all apart. "I have no ring," she said, a tear finally tracing a warm path down her cold cheek. Kai smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and lit them from within. "Then take this," he said. From a small pouch on his belt, he pulled a small carved wooden pendant. It was shaped like a feather, worn smooth with time. "For strength," he said, placing it in her palm, "and for flight." Talon removed a thin, strong strand of hide from his own wrist, the one he used to tie back his hair. He gently, carefully, tied it around her wrist. "And this," he said, his voice a low growl of emotion, "for roots." Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes as she looked from the feather in her hand to the leather on her wrist, at the two men who had become her anchors and her wings. "Then I will fly," she whispered, "and I will stay." They stood in a small, tight triangle, their breath rising around them like smoke from a sacred fire. The world outside could howl all it wanted. The town could whisper its poison. Nothing else mattered. Later, as dusk fell, she stood on the porch again, watching the wind roll softly across the hills. Behind her, the hearth glowed warm and bright. The cabin was no longer empty. It pulsed with quiet laughter, with shared tasks, with the steady breathing of a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The girl who had once whispered, "Just one night," was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had claimed her own name, her own life, and two hearts that now beat beside her own. As she leaned against the porch rail, her eyes wide to the endless white horizon, she thought about the strange, cruel, and beautiful turns of life. Sometimes, the world sends you wolves when all you asked for was a little warmth. But if you are brave enough, if you are strong enough, you just might find that they were the only ones willing to stay and guard your fire when everyone else had already run from the cold. Then, she turned, stepped back inside, and closed the door on winter. And if you believe that courage is the light that shines brightest in the dark, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because stories like Honora's remind us that even in the coldest of winters, the bravest hearts can always build a home.